Right now, across Europe, the sky is lying to you. The same heat that's been baking the continent for days is about to pack its bags and move, but not away. It's heading straight for millions of people who have no idea what's coming. And if you think this is just another heat wave story, stay with me for the next few minutes, because what's unfolding right now is one of the sharpest weather splits Europe has seen in weeks. And depending on where you live, you are either about to catch a break or you're about to walk straight into the hottest stretch of your entire summer. Let's start with the basics of what's actually happening up there, because this isn't random. There is a jet stream, a fast river of air high above our heads, and right now that river is sitting in a very specific position. That position is what has been keeping high pressure locked over large parts of Europe, and high pressure means clear skies, sinking air, and heat that just builds and builds with nowhere to escape. That's exactly why today, and for a lot of you tomorrow, is going to feel like the peak of your week. But here's the twist. That jet stream is not staying put. Over the next several days, it is going to dip and shift further south. And when the storm track moves, the heat has to move with it. That's the entire story in one sentence, but the details are where it gets interesting, and honestly, a little bit alarming depending on your location. So picture Europe divided by an invisible line right now. Above that line, in places like Scotland, Ireland, Norway, Sweden, and Finland, the air is about to change. Cooler temperatures are moving in, and this isn't just a 1 or 2 degree dip. Over the next 7 days, these northern zones are going to run below average. And when I say below average, I mean it by a real noticeable margin. This trend doesn't just last a few days either. Looking further out, this cooler pattern appears to hold all the way through the end of the month and even creeps into the beginning of September. So if you've been sweating through the last week up north, relief really is on the way, and it's not a fluke. It's a pattern shift that the models are agreeing on. But here's where the story flips, because south of that line, and especially as you move east, the exact opposite is happening. The core of the heat isn't disappearing, it's relocating. And it's relocating into places that are already dealing with drought, already dealing with wildfires, and now about to deal with even higher temperatures stacked on top of all of that. This is the part of the forecast that worries meteorologists the most, because it's not just about discomfort anymore, it's about risk. Fire risk, health risk, and agricultural risk, all rising together in the exact same region at the exact same time. Before we get into the numbers, it helps to understand why this particular shift matters so much more than a typical week-to-week change in temperature. Europe has already been dealing with an extended stretch of heat this summer, and when a heat wave lingers for weeks rather than days, it doesn't just make people uncomfortable, it dries out soil, stresses rivers and reservoirs, and pushes vegetation into a state where it becomes far more flammable than usual. So, when meteorologists talk about a heat wave shifting rather than breaking entirely, that's actually an important distinction. This isn't a case of the atmosphere resetting and giving the whole continent a clean slate. It's a redistribution of the same underlying energy, moving from one region into another, and the region receiving it is often the one least equipped to handle it, either because it's already dealing with drought, or because its infrastructure simply isn't built for sustained extreme heat. There's also a psychological element to this that's worth mentioning, because forecasts like this one tend to create a strange kind of relief for people in the cooling zones, while almost being ignored by people in the warming zones until the heat actually arrives on their doorstep. That's part of why we're walking through this so carefully today, region by region, because the goal isn't just to tell you what the weather will be, it's to make sure you actually have time to prepare if you're in one of the areas about to get hit harder than you might expect. Let's actually walk through the numbers because they tell this story better than any description can. Today and tomorrow, high pressure is dominant across huge sections of the continent, and for a lot of areas, tomorrow is going to be the hottest day of the entire week. Take London, for example. Tomorrow afternoon, expect around 28 degrees. Head over to Amsterdam and Brussels, and you're looking at numbers closer to 30, maybe 31 degrees, with a few pockets running even hotter than that. That's brutal for a lot of people who aren't used to that kind of heat, especially without air conditioning being as common in parts of Northern Europe. Now fast forward to Saturday. Once that storm track has shifted south, London drops to around 26 degrees. Dublin comes in around 21. Amsterdam eases back to about 24, and Brussels settles around 26 as well. Scotland sees one of the biggest swings, dropping all the way down to around 17 degrees in some spots. That is a massive change in just a matter of days, and it's going to feel like an entirely different season for people living in those areas. Still warm in places, sure, but nothing like the intensity we're seeing right now. Meanwhile, in the south and southwest, the story barely changes, and in some cases, it gets worse. Portugal, Spain, and France remain locked into hot conditions, and the same goes for parts of Switzerland and Italy. Tomorrow, Madrid is expected to hit around 35 degrees. Rome climbs to 37. Paris comes in around 32 for a Tuesday afternoon, which is intense for that region this time of year. As we move toward Saturday, Paris does ease back a little, dropping to around 29, and Zurich sees a slight dip too, as that storm track pulls the edge off the heat just enough to notice. But don't let that fool you into thinking the danger's over, because Rome, Madrid, and Lisbon stay firmly in the hot zone, with Lisbon holding around 32 degrees, and coastal areas seeing just a touch of relief compared to inland regions that are going to keep baking. It's worth noting just how wide this temperature swing actually is when you look at it as a whole. We're talking about drops of 10, 11, even 12 degrees in some northern locations within the span of just a few days. That's not a gentle seasonal transition, that's a hard pivot, the kind of shift that changes what people wear, how they plan their week, and whether outdoor events even go ahead as scheduled. For anyone with outdoor plans, weddings, festivals, sporting events, this kind of swing is exactly the sort of thing you want to track closely. Because the difference between Tuesday and Saturday in some of these cities is going to feel like the difference between two entirely different months. Now, let's talk about Central Europe, because this is where the shift becomes really noticeable day by day. Tomorrow, Germany and Poland are heating up significantly, with Poland pushing toward 29 degrees. But by the time we reach the weekend, these numbers start trending downward across the board as that cooler air and the shifting storm track make their way through the region. It's a gradual process, not an overnight flip, so if you're in this zone, expect a few more genuinely hot days before you start feeling that shift take hold. And then there's Southeastern Europe, which honestly is where this whole story becomes most serious. Athens is looking at around 36 degrees tomorrow, and that's just the starting point. Countries like Czechia, Slovakia, and Hungary, along with Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, Kosovo, Montenegro, Albania, and North Macedonia are all running well above average, with numbers sitting in the mid to upper 30s. Ukraine is seeing similar intensity, with temperatures hovering around 33 degrees. As we move toward Saturday, instead of cooling down like the rest of the continent, this region actually sees the heat nudge even higher in spots. Albania and Greece could push toward 38 degrees by the weekend. That's the core of the heat wave settling in, right as everyone else starts to cool off. Hungary, Romania, and Serbia remain the epicenter, and honestly, if you live in this stretch of Europe, this is the part of the forecast you need to pay the closest attention to, because this isn't a peak that passes quickly. It's a heat wave that's relocating and intensifying in your direction. It's also worth pointing out how this region has been trending over the summer as a whole. Southeastern Europe has already seen repeated rounds of extreme heat this year, and each additional round tends to compound the effects of the last one. Soil moisture doesn't recover in a single cooler day, rivers don't refill from one scattered storm, and once vegetation dries out to a certain point, it takes sustained rainfall over an extended period to bring conditions back to something resembling normal. That's exactly why this particular shift is being watched so closely by climate and emergency response agencies across the region. It's not just about how hot it gets this week, it's about what this does to an already fragile situation heading into the back half of the summer. Now, heat is only half of the story. The other half is rain, or more specifically, the lack of it, and where it does show up, what kind of trouble it might bring with it. Overall, across most of the continent, we are running below average when it comes to precipitation. That brown shading you'd see on a rainfall map right now, that represents dryness, and unfortunately, that's the story for most of Europe over the coming week. That matters enormously, because dry ground combined with intense heat is exactly the recipe that fuels wildfires, and we already know how serious that threat has become in recent seasons. That said, it's not dry everywhere, and the areas that do get rain are going to see it concentrated in specific bursts, rather than steady, soaking showers. Ireland, Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and parts of England are in line for a better chance of rain over the coming days. Iceland sees some showers moving through as well, along with the Faroe Islands and Shetland Islands. As we move into Wednesday, additional bands of rain push across Scotland and swing up towards Sweden, Finland, Norway, Estonia, and Latvia, with a few thunderstorms mixed in for good measure. Czechia and Germany could see a spotty, isolated storm here and there, and Denmark, the Netherlands, and Belgium get a similar scattered pattern. The wetter conditions really concentrate around the UK and Ireland, and that moisture is going to help keep temperatures in check in those areas, working hand in hand with the cooler air already moving in. Now here's where it gets a bit more dangerous. France, Switzerland, and Belgium desperately need rain right now, and they are going to get some. But the problem is, it won't last nearly long enough to make a real dent in the drought. Worse, these storms can bring lightning, and dry lightning combined with parched vegetation is one of the most common ways new wildfires ignite. So, paradoxically, the rain that everyone's been hoping for could actually spark new fire. Activity in some of these regions before it does any good. Germany, Switzerland, and Austria are all in line for a storm or two over the coming days, and then that activity shifts further south into Italy as we move toward Wednesday. Bulgaria, North Macedonia, Greece, and Albania could also see a shower or a storm pop up, and if it does, expect gusty winds and lightning along with the potential for sudden heavy downpours. Looking at this over a 5-day window heading into Friday, England stays relatively dry, while areas further north and west, particularly Ireland and Scotland, get the better chance at meaningful rainfall, with some locations potentially topping 100 millimeters. Most other spots fall somewhere between 25 and 50 millimeters. Norway, Sweden, and Finland could see anywhere from 50 to 75 millimeters in places, though the chance of a shower stays relatively small overall. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Germany, and Poland might pick up a bit over 25 millimeters in a few spots, often coming with a thunderstorm attached. And then there's the real hotspot for rainfall, stretching from France and Andorra back through Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and Italy, where thunderstorms could deliver as much as 100 millimeters in isolated pockets. Bulgaria, Serbia, and Romania will see some storm activity too, but it's lighter. And remember, this is exactly the region where the core of the heat is settling in, so any rain relief here is going to be short-lived at best. There's another layer to this rainfall story that doesn't always get enough attention, and that's wildfire smoke. When fires are already burning in one region, and a shift in wind direction accompanies a storm track change like this one, smoke can travel remarkably long distances, sometimes affecting air quality in areas that aren't even experiencing the heat or the fires themselves. If you notice hazy skies, a smoky smell, or unusually vivid sunsets over the coming days, even somewhere that feels far removed from the active fire zones, that's very likely smoke being carried along by the same atmospheric pattern we've been discussing. It's a good reminder that these weather systems don't operate in isolated boxes. Everything from temperature to rainfall to air quality is connected through the same broader pattern moving across the continent. So what does all of this actually mean if you zoom out and look at the big picture? The heat wave currently gripping Europe is shifting south and east over the coming days. That's the headline. Some areas are going to feel real relief, a noticeable welcome drop in temperature paired with a better chance of rain. Northern Europe, that's your good news story this week. But for everyone else, particularly those in southeastern Europe, the situation isn't improving, it's intensifying. The heat isn't disappearing, it's simply moving to where you are, and in some cases, it's arriving even stronger than what Northern Europe just experienced. And underneath all of this sits a much bigger, much more serious concern, which is drought. Even in areas getting some rainfall, the amounts we're talking about are nowhere near enough to reverse months of dryness. The ground remains parched in most locations. Vegetation remains stressed, and that combination continues to set the stage for wildfire activity across huge stretches of the continent. Firefighters and emergencies. Crews are already stretched thin in several countries, working to contain blazes that have been burning for days, sometimes weeks, and this next stretch of weather isn't going to make their job any easier. In the areas where the heat is building rather than easing, especially across the Balkans and into parts of Eastern Europe, the wildfire risk is only going up from here, not down. It's worth pausing on that for a second, because it's easy to look at a forecast like this and just see numbers, degrees, and millimeters. But behind every one of those numbers are real people. People trying to keep their homes cool without overwhelming the power grid. Farmers watching their crops struggle under weeks of dry heat. Emergency responders working double shifts to keep fires contained before they spread into populated areas. This shift in the weather pattern isn't just an interesting meteorological story. It's something that directly affects daily life for tens of millions of people across an entire continent, and the stakes only get higher as we move deeper into August. So here's the simple way to think about it. If you live in the north, in places like Scotland, Ireland, or the Nordic countries, expect cooler air, a better chance of rain, and a genuine break from the heat that should last through the rest of the month and into early September. If you're in Central Europe, expect a transition period, still hot for the next day or two, but gradually easing as that storm track pulls south. And if you're in Southeastern Europe, in Hungary, Romania, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, or anywhere nearby, brace yourself because the heat is coming your way, and it's arriving with intensity rather than easing off. Let's talk for a moment about what this actually feels like on the ground, because numbers on a map can only tell you so much. In the north, going from a stretch of days near 30 degrees down into the high teens or low 20s is going to feel like autumn arrived early, even though we're still only in early August. People will pull out light jackets again, outdoor cafes will feel comfortable rather than stifling, and the constant hum of fans and air conditioners running at full blast should finally start to quiet down. It's the kind of shift that, after weeks of relentless heat, genuinely changes the mood of an entire region. Meanwhile, in the south and east, the experience is going to be the opposite. For places already sitting in the mid-30s, Pushing into the upper 30s means crossing into territory where heat becomes a genuine health hazard, not just an inconvenience. This is when hospitals typically see upticks in heat-related illness, when outdoor labor becomes dangerous during peak afternoon hours, and when simple things like staying hydrated and finding shade become genuinely important safety measures rather than just comfort tips. If you're in this zone, or if you have family or friends there, this is the week to check in, to make sure elderly relatives have a way to stay cool and to avoid unnecessary outdoor exertion during the hottest parts of the day, typically between noon and early evening. This kind of pattern, where a heat wave doesn't break but instead relocates, is becoming an increasingly familiar story across Europe in recent summers. It's a reminder that even when one region gets relief, that doesn't mean the overall pressure on the continent is easing. It often just means the pressure has found a new place to land. And with drought conditions already stacking up in the wrong direction across so much of Europe, every shift like this one carries real consequences, not just for comfort, but for water supplies, agriculture, and public safety. Think about what drought actually does to a region over time, because it's easy to underestimate just how much damage builds up quietly in the background, while everyone's attention is focused on the headline temperature numbers. Reservoir levels drop, and once they drop far enough, water restrictions start getting introduced in cities and towns that rarely need them. Farmers watching their fields see crop yields shrink, sometimes dramatically. And that has ripple effects that extend well beyond the growing season into food prices and supply chains that stretch across the entire continent. Rivers that normally support shipping traffic can drop low enough to disrupt transport routes, which is something that's already happened in parts of Europe in recent summers. None of this shows up directly on a 7-day forecast map, but it's the slow, cumulative backdrop against which every one of these heat waves is playing out, and it's part of why meteorologists and climate scientists pay such close attention to patterns like the one we're seeing this week, not just the day-to-day temperature swings themselves. There's also the question of how this affects power grids, particularly in the areas where the heat is intensifying rather than easing. Air conditioning demand spikes dramatically during extended heat events, and when millions of people across an entire region are running cooling systems simultaneously during peak afternoon hours, that puts enormous strain on electricity infrastructure. Some countries have already experienced rolling brownouts or requested voluntary reductions in energy use during past heat waves, and with this pattern pushing intensified heat into southeastern Europe over the coming days, it wouldn't be surprising to see similar measures discussed again in the affected countries. It's one more example of how a weather pattern that sounds simple on paper, a shift in the jet stream, storm track moving south, actually cascades into dozens of practical real-world consequences for the people living through it. It's also worth taking a moment to talk about how forecasters actually track a shift like this, because it's not just a guess based on how things feel right now. Meteorologists rely on multiple weather models, run by different agencies around the world, that simulate how the atmosphere is likely to behave over the coming days and weeks. When several of these models start agreeing on the same general outcome, in this case, a jet stream dip pulling the storm track in the core of the heat further south and east, that agreement gives forecasters much more confidence in the pattern actually holding. It's not a perfect science. Weather patterns can and do shift again, sometimes within just a day or two of a forecast being issued. But when you see this kind of consistency across models looking 7, 10, even 14 days out, it's a strong signal that the broad strokes of this pattern are likely to verify, even if the exact numbers in any one city shift slightly as we get closer to the date. This is also a good moment to mention just how quickly conditions can change once a pattern like this actually takes hold. In the north, that shift toward cooler, wetter weather could arrive with genuine intensity. Not just a gradual cooling, but a noticeable change within 24 to 48 hours in some areas, especially where a stronger band of rain moves through. Similarly, in the southeast, the transition into more intense heat isn't necessarily going to be a smooth, gradual climb. It could arrive as a sudden jump once high pressure fully settles into place. That's part of why staying updated over the coming days matters, rather than just looking at a single forecast and assuming it holds perfectly through the entire week. As we move through the rest of this week and into the weekend, keep an eye on how this storm track behaves, because these patterns can adjust, sometimes faster than expected. What we know right now is that the core of the heat is moving south and east, that northern Europe is stepping into a stretch of cooler, wetter weather, and that the regions already struggling with dryness and fire risk are about to face even more pressure. It's a split-screen kind of week for the continent, relief on one side, intensification on the other, and the line between them is the one to watch most closely over the coming days. Let's also touch briefly on the wider context here, because this shift doesn't exist in a vacuum. Europe has seen a pattern in recent summers of heat waves that don't simply arrive and fade, but instead migrate across the continent, settling in one region for a stretch of days before the atmosphere reorganizes and pushes that heat somewhere else entirely. Some summers this happens once or twice. Other summers, like parts of what we've seen recently, this kind of relocation happens repeatedly, with the core of the heat essentially touring different parts of the continent over the course of several weeks. Each time it does, it leaves behind a slightly drier landscape and slightly more strained water resources than before, which means the impact of any single heat wave is never really isolated. It's layered on top of everything that came before it. That layering effect is part of why this particular shift deserves more attention than a routine forecast update. It's not just about who gets hot and who gets cooler this week. It's about where this fits into the broader trajectory of the summer as a whole and what it means for the weeks still ahead. If southeastern Europe is already dealing with drought and now receives an intensified round of heat on top of that, the margin for error going into the rest of August shrinks considerably. Firefighting resources that are already stretched thin have even less room to absorb a new wave of fire activity. Water systems that are already under pressure have even less buffer if this pattern repeats again before real, sustained rainfall arrives. So if you're in the north, enjoy the break. You've earned it after the stretch you've just been through. And if you're in the south or east, stay alert, stay cautious with anything involving open flame or dry vegetation, and keep watching the updates as this pattern continues to evolve, because this is far from over. The sky might be shifting where it sends the heat, but for a large part of Europe, the intensity isn't going away anytime soon. It's simply finding a new address, and unfortunately, that address happens to be exactly where so many people are already struggling with the driest, most fire-prone conditions of the entire summer. If there's one thing to take away from everything we've covered today, it's that this week's forecast is really a story about movement, not disappearance. The heat isn't leaving Europe, it's relocating within it, trading one set of vulnerable regions for another, and carrying all of its risks along with it. Keep watching how this storm track evolves over the coming days, because the exact boundary between the cooler north and the intensifying south and east could still shift slightly as new data comes in. For now, take the forecast seriously wherever you are, prepare accordingly, and make sure the people around you, especially anyone more vulnerable to extreme heat, know what's headed their way. Stay safe, stay cool where you need to, watch out for one another, and we'll keep tracking this pattern closely as it continues to evolve and develop over the days and weeks ahead.